Today's message, we're going to cover the end of 2 Kings. But I know you're so happy about this. It's not the last message of the series. We're going to end on a different note. We're going to come back with one more before we turn into an Advent series. But for now, today, we're going to drop into two eerily similar stories that I hope today don't just come across as historical fact, but instead stand as something that could be in our future that we need to react to as well. But before we dive in, I need to reteach or refresh your minds of a principle we talked about years ago, but after I throw it back up on the screen, you'll be like, oh, I hear that language in Logan a lot, because it's pretty formative for me, and I think it can be formative for you. It's not original to me. Andy Stanley wrote a book on this, okay? You can read it. But it's this, the principle of the path. There it is. It's this. Direction, not intention, determines destination. Let me say it again so it washes over your consciousness. You ready? Direction, not intention, determines destination. But most of the time, we live our lives as if our intention is going to get us to where we want to go. I don't think many of us intend for our lives to be a walking disaster. Anybody in the room, like that's what I'm shooting for? Of course not. But we're all tempted, at least from time to time, if not in large part, to determine our actions and plan a course for our life based on what we think is good. And I want to just bring it back to the forefront of your mind today that you and I are not in charge of determining what is good. Okay? We do a really bad job of that. God, who is in his character wholly good with a W, like entirely good, is the one who sets the standard of goodness. So we as human beings align with what he says is good to achieve a good life. That's a really important point. If you try to live your life based on what you think is good, which seems like a good intention, it will not get you to your desired destination. Because direction, which is determined by God for what's good, determines destination, not our intention. Today, we're going to see the principle of the path at work in the kings of the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. None of them, I don't think, other than maybe a couple of them, were trying to be bad kings, okay? That seems silly. Like, why would you want to be in control of a nation and be inherently bad? What they did is determine what they thought was good for themselves, and we're able to look back on it and be like, that was kind of a bad choice. But most of the times in our lives, we're not coming up with important decisions thinking, this is going to really screw me up. That's not usually, although sometimes. Some of us have self-sabotaging personalities to some extent, but most of the time we're not thinking, all right, I can't wait to make this decision because it's going to make my life a living hell for the next few years. That's not how we approach things. And I don't think that's how even the kings of the northern kingdom, which are told to us to be like just terrible, terrible kings, were trying to be. My guess is their intention was to be the best king they could. The problem is they were using other adjacent kingdoms in the ancient Near East to determine what a good king should do. Worshipping other gods, having different standards, hoarding wealth, rather than looking to God and the scriptures to determine what a good king should look like, which, by the way, he is very clear about, and it's quite simple. They decided to allow the standards of the culture around them to decide what was good. Their intention was to be the king that they were supposed to be, but they were taking steps in a direction that leads them to a destination none of them foresaw or wanted to be in, even though prophets were screaming it at them for generations. So, in order to kind of get to the story today, I just want to do a quick recap because this has been a long series and we've introduced a bunch of characters. Here's the quick historical rundown, and I want you to be thinking, okay, do I see a pattern here? Can you all determine the direction they're heading? Are you ready? First off, we started with David, right? David in his older years at the beginning of the book. And while he had been a man after God's own heart, which meant even though he didn't follow him flawlessly, he always came back. when someone confronted him. He was always willing to return to the Lord when he did bad things. God's not asking you to be perfect. He's just asking you to follow his heart and come home. Okay? But at the end of his life, David was abdicating his leadership responsibility. Remember this? He's laying in a bed. He can't keep warm. He hasn't even said who's going to take over the kingdom. And it puts his family life in peril. A bunch of his sons die in the process. Not great. Solomon takes over after David, and Solomon is given, remember, wisdom beyond compare as a gift from God. So if there's anyone who's ever lived who should have been able to determine what God says is good, the direction he's supposed to head, and head in that direction step after step after step, it should have been Solomon. But what does he do? With his wisdom, rather than pursuing God's goodness, he pursues the lusts of the flesh, the desires of the world, and the pride of life. Now, his son has a chance to fix things, because towards the end of Solomon's reign, he was involved in slavery and forced labor camps, and everyone had had enough. They come to his son and they say, all right, we'll follow you if you're willing to not be like your dad, if you're willing to return to God, lighten the load. And what does he do? Do you remember? Rather than listening to good advice, he finds an echo chamber of his peers who are saying, nah, man, you need to double down, make it even worse, show him who's boss. And he tries, and the nation splits. This was somebody a young buck who's too prideful to see the clear, right decision in front of him. Again, it wasn't his intention for the nation to split, but the direction he headed put the nation in that destination. And then Jeroboam becomes the ruler in the north. Remember him? God said, I'm going to take the kingdom from Solomon. He gives him 10 pieces of cloak and says, you're going to lead 10 tribes. It's going to be awesome. All you have to do is trust me. 2 words. If you trust me, like David trusted me, you'll forever reign over this kingdom, and you will lead it in the right direction. But what happens? The second insecurity bubbles up in Jeroboam. He decides to build 2 golden calves, which in our mind, thinking back to Exodus, should mean twice the sin of the time in Exodus where God said, I just want to wipe them out. Like, this is a bad moment for Jeroboam. It doesn't go well at all. All God said was, trust me. But he said, if I trust God, that people are going to go find God in Jerusalem. They're going to want to go back to the old ways, and I'm going to lose power. So I've got to protect my kingdom. God gave it to me. I need to protect it. Do you believe that Jeroboam's intention was to lead the nation away from God? I don't think so. But he did things that God said were not good, and were not going to lead the nation to the destination it needed to go. And man, you know what's really sad? Jeroboam becomes the standard of measurement for badness for like 14 generations of kings. Could you imagine your family looking back on you in 5 generations, measuring whether or not they were good based on how bad you were? Like, Jeroboam becomes a really bad measuring stick. You wouldn't want to be him at all. It's crazy. His intention's not to undermine Yahweh, it's to secure his kingdom, but intention doesn't matter. Direction does when we're heading for a godly destination. So Jeroboam puts the nation, the northern kingdom at least, of Israel in a bad, bad spot, heading down the wrong path. You know what's sad? King after king after king takes one more step in the direction that Jeroboam has established towards a destination that they don't want to go to at all. Eventually, in chapter 14, we end up with Jeroboam II, which we shouldn't be surprised. He's kind of a bad guy. He puts the nation in a bad place. His namesake even proves it. So much so that God has to raise up a prophet from Judah. You remember this guy named Amos to point out Jeroboam II's sins? You know you're not great if a major prophet from the Old Testament has to be raised up to specifically address you and your sin. Something has gone wrong here. Time after time after time, God sends prophets to call kings back to him. That's all he ever wanted. Will you trust me? Will you come home? Will you come back? I can put you on a new path, a different direction that leads to the right destination. And time after time after time, the kings of the north and the south, to a large degree, say, nah, we're going to determine what's good. Chapter 15 is like a whole list of them. We've got Zechariah, son of Jeroboam II. Guess what he decides to do? What's evil in the Lord's sight, as his ancestors had done. He refused to turn from the sins that Jeroboam led Israel to commit. Here's that measuring rod. And then we can jump to verse 18. Menahem did what was evil in the Lord's sight. During his entire reign, he refused to turn from the sins of Jeroboam. Pekahiah, these names are intense. Who knows if I'm saying them right? I'm just saying them with confidence. Pekahiah did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to turn from the sins of Jeroboam. Pekah, is it ever going to end? Did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to turn from the sins of. Can you see the path? Have you been able to sense the direction? Yeah. Israel, unfortunately, is now going to arrive at the destination they never saw coming, even though it was told to them time after time after time. 2 Kings chapter 17 says this, Hosea began to rule over Israel in the 12th year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. He reigned in Samaria 9 years. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight. But listen to the difference. But not to the same extent as the kings of Israel who ruled before him. Doesn't that seem like a little glimmer of hope, right? Like if you're watching, what is that thing called? The actual machine where you see heart rates? No nurses in the room? Okay, whatever. It's like it was flatlined, and there's a bloop. Oh, there's maybe a tiny bit of hope. He's not as bad as the people before him. They don't even reference Jeroboam. Maybe this is a new direction, right? That line contains a lesson that is so rarely talked about in Christian circles that it's scary. So I'm going to give it to you explicitly, okay? Here's the truth from this one line of the Old Testament that applies throughout all of the New Testament as well. God doesn't judge you based on how you stack up against other people. He judges you based on your potential in Jesus. If you are living your life thinking that God is okay with you because you're not as bad as your mom, or you're doing better off in life than your siblings, or your coworkers like you better than somebody else, you are in a perilous place. Because God doesn't judge you based on how you compare to somebody else. He judges you based on how you compare to Jesus, and that's a standard that none of us are going to rise up to unless we accept and place our trust in him and ask for forgiveness. Man, I see this happen all the time. It's tempting to imagine that really all we need to do in life is shoot for a little bit better than our parents, right? I mean, tons of us do that. Like, if I can just have my life be a little bit better than them, and my kids have a little bit of a leg up, and like I get a boat before my brother does, right? Like, we set all these weird, strange standards and expectations, and then we shoot for those as goals because we are deciding to determine what good might look like, rather than what God has set to be good. And we think, man, Jesus is going to be perfectly fine with me if I'm just a tiny bit better than my neighbor. It's a scary place to be because Hosea, he wasn't as bad as the other kings. In fact, the couple of verses after this talk about how he really had a good intention. He wanted to free the nation of Israel from their Assyrian power that kind of had their thumb on them. He stopped paying the Assyrian rulers their tribute, and he wants to allow Israel, God's people, to really reign and rule again. The problem is, rather than turning to God, the direction all of us need to follow, he turns south, and he asks for help from the king of Egypt, which, based on the history between God's people and Egypt, should have been a red flag, but it wasn't. God's not happy when our life is struggling, and even if our intention is good, if we turn to other things than him to get to where we need to go. To place our trust in things that he would not call good to try to get us through. Yahweh is not happy with the king of the north turning to Egypt in the south. So I wonder today, what do you turn to in your life to get a leg up on your peers? Like, what are the goals and the standards that you're shooting for that may, honestly today, if you were to search your heart, feel like good intentions, but are not what God has proclaimed to be a good direction. In Exodus, the first commandment is what? Does anybody know? You shall have no other. There we go. You'll have no other gods before me. The consequence of breaking that, if you are to read it in the book of Exodus, is death and exile. That's not great. Now, does God do that? Does he strike everyone dead who makes an idol? He doesn't. You know why? He's merciful and loving and compassionate and slow to anger, and he's willing for all of us to repent. Time after time after time, we see that character on display. But there's a question throughout all the Old Testament and all the New Testament. Is God going to look down from heaven forever and allow stupidity to rule and reign, to allow ungodliness to get out of control and just sabotage everybody's life? If you look at Noah's story, the answer is no. If you look at the book of Kings, the answer is no. And if you look at the book of Revelation, in the end, the answer is no. Here's what happens. God in his mercy has given his people 1,000,000 chances to repent, turn around, come back to him, get on the right path, move in the right direction. Chapter 17, verse 5, then the king of Assyria invaded the entire land. And for 3 years, he besieged the city of Samaria. Finally, on the 9th year of King Hosea's reign, Samaria, their capital, fell. And the people of Israel were exiled to Assyria. That's not great. If you were God's chosen people, would you ever imagine that he would allow that to happen to you? That's the what. But then the text also gives us the why. This disaster came upon the people of Israel because they worshiped other gods. Jump forward for me, guys. They sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them safely out of Egypt and rescued them from the power of Pharaoh. They had followed the practices of pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of them, as well as the practices of kings of Israel that had introduced, like Jeroboam. The people of Israel had also secretly done many things that were not pleasing to the Lord their God. They built pagan shrines for themselves in all of their towns, from the smallest outpost to the largest walled city. They set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles on the top of every hill and under every green tree. They offered sacrifices on those hilltops, just like the nations the Lord had driven out of the land ahead of them. So the people of Israel did many evil things, arousing the Lord's anger. Yes, they worshipped idols, despite the Lord's specific and repeated warnings. Again and again, the Lord sent his prophets and seers to warn both Israel and Judah. Turn from your evil ways. Come home. Obey my commandments and decrees, the entire law I commanded your ancestors to obey, that I gave through my servants, the prophets. But Israel would not listen. They were stubborn, as their ancestors who refused to believe the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he made with their ancestors and despised all of his warnings. They worshiped worthless idols, so they became worthless themselves. They followed the examples of the nations around them, disobeying the Lord's command not to imitate them. They rejected all the commands of the Lord their God and made 2, I repeat, not 1, but 2 calves from metal. They set up Asherah poles and worshipped Baal and all the forces of heaven. They even sacrificed their own sons and daughters in the fire. They consulted fortune tellers and practiced sorcery and sold themselves to evil. God is literally throwing the book of Deuteronomy at them. Because the Lord was very angry with Israel, the consequence finally comes due. He swept them away from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah remained in the land, but even the people of Judah refused to obey the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the evil practices that Israel had introduced. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel. He punished them by handing them over to their attackers until he had banished Israel from his presence. Yikes. For when the Lord tore Israel away from the kingdom of David, he chose who? Jeroboam to be their king. But Jeroboam drew Israel away from following the Lord, set them in the wrong direction, and made them commit a great sin. And the people of Israel persisted step after step in their evil ways of Jeroboam. They didn't turn from these sins until the Lord finally swept them away from his presence, just as his prophets had warned. So Israel was exiled from their land to Assyria, where they remain to this day. You know what's really troubling about this? These are considered the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Unlike the story of people coming back with Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Zerubbabel rebuilding things, the people who come home from the Babylonian captivity, these guys don't. They're the diaspora Jews. They're the ones that Paul is encountering all over the world when he has his later missionary journeys. They don't come home. It's that bad. I want to point out just a couple of things before we move on. There's so much densely packed in here, but I'm not going to go through it line by line. That would just be painful. But here's something that's important. This entire scene happens because they refuse to trust Yahweh. It's rendered believe in the text today. This all happened because they failed to believe in Yahweh, but it could be rendered more appropriately from the Hebrew. They didn't trust in, they didn't rely upon, they didn't see Yahweh as their real source. So lacking confidence in God, they placed their trust elsewhere. Does that apply to your life? I mean, it does to mine. Think of all the small ways that you're lacking trust in God and all the safeguards you've built up in your life. Spiritually, relationally, financially, what is it? Like, what are the things in your life right now that you have good intentions for, but are actually keeping you from trusting totally in God? Martin Luther, Reformation Martin Luther, commented on this verse saying this: whatever your heart clings to and relies on is your God. You know what that is? It's a way of restating the first commandment, that you will have no other gods before me. Direction, not intention, determines destination. There's a lot of things that we think are good and appropriate in our lives that are actually keeping God from being front and center and first. You need to figure out what that might look like in your life today. Secondly is this. Verse 15 points out that they are worshiping worthless idols, so they became worthless themselves. This is an attempt of a translation from the Hebrew words. Go back. An attempt of the translation of Hebrew words to give us a kind of a word picture or make a moral judgment. The actual word here in the Hebrew is vapor. They worshipped vapor, so they became vapor themselves. And that's a little bit harder to understand, so let me help you process it a little bit. They were pursuing something that didn't even have substance. They were worshiping idols that looked like people and animals, and they were placing their hope and trust in that as if that had any real power and substance. So since they were worshiping a vapor, something you can kind of see but has no force in the world, God vaporized them. Ooh, that's a scary picture. It's like a little gun from Star Wars, right? There wasn't stun and vaporized or something, right? Is that not Star Wars? Star Trek. I'm not a science, fiction buff. Although I like all of that stuff. So whoever is a diehard fan who just wants to murder me right now, calm down. That's worthless. No, I'm kidding. I'm digging the hole here. Don't trust in worthless things. Because at the end of your life, you don't want to be like Solomon and look back and say, it was all worthless. It was vain. Didn't have any substance. Don't let your life turn to vapor. This is eerily similar, by the way, to how Paul describes the reality of all of us, every human being's life in Romans chapter 1. Verse 21, he says this: they've got no excuse for not knowing God. Yeah, they knew God, but they wouldn't even worship him or give thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God is like. Right? They created God in their image of what they thought was good. As a result, their minds became dark and confused, claiming to be wise. They instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols that were made to look like people and birds and animals and reptiles. So what's the result? God abandoned them to whatever shameful things their hearts desired. it's not a pleasant message today. Like, this is not, it doesn't like make you want to say, yay, praise Jesus. It's more like, oh, don't let that be my life. And maybe that's what it's supposed to say to you today, because direction, not intention, determines destination. I imagine King Hosea, right? The guy who's in charge of the nation of Israel when the Assyrians invade and destroy everything and displace his land. I can imagine him being led behind like a mule, chained, looking back at his city burning and all of his people dead all around and leaving, like trying to hold on to their sick kids, not knowing where they're going. And I can imagine the tearful eyes, him saying, this is never what I wanted to happen. I didn't intend for any of this. But intention doesn't lead us to the right destination. I felt like I was doing the right thing. How many of you have been there in your life? The southern kingdom watches all of this happen. And they're reflecting on what it means that God was willing to actually follow through on the promises and threats that the prophets had said to the north. What they should have done, the right way to respond to this terrible situation, is they should have cried out to God and been like, no! Like, yeah, we had lots of disagreements, but those were our friends and family. Those are the tribes of the sons of Jesse. Like, God, how could this happen? And then beyond lamenting and being sad about what had happened, they should have been like, this is a wake-up call, guys. Like, God is for real about this stuff. We need to repent of our sins and turn back to him. We don't want what happened up there to happen to us. That's what should have happened. It sounds even natural. But that's not the attitude of the folks from the south. Instead, their sentiment is something like this. This is just me making it up, but I think it's a fair description. Serves them right. I saw this coming a mile away. They had no right to follow somebody who wasn't from David's line. Just goes to show, we are God's chosen people, not them. God would never let that happen to us. Ooh. You can see where they think that. Time passes, a few chapters pass, and we get an eerie, similar scene. This time, things come to a head with Jehoiachin in the south, which is quite a name. And then they really disintegrate under Zedekiah. Here's the story, chapter 24, verses 8 through 20. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, young buck. He ruled in Jerusalem 3 months. Jehoiachin did what was evil in the Lord's sight, just like his father had done. Continuing on, during Jehoiachin's reign, the officers of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came up against Jerusalem and besieged it. Nebuchadnezzar himself arrived at the city during the siege. Then King Jehoiachin, along with the queen mother, his advisors, his commanders, and his officials, they surrendered to the Babylonians. In the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he took Jehoiachin prisoner, as the Lord had said beforehand. Nebuchadnezzar carried away all the treasures from the Lord's temple and the royal palace. He stripped away all the gold objects King Solomon had placed in the temple. King Nebuchadnezzar took all of Jerusalem captive, including all the commanders, the best soldiers, craftsmen, artisans, 10,000 in all. Only the poorest people, who were considered not a threat, were left in the land. Nebuchadnezzar led King Jehoiachin away as a captive to Babylon, along with his queen mother, his wives, his officials, and all of Jerusalem's elite. He also exiled 7,000 of the best troops, 1,000 craftsmen and artisans, all of whom were strong and fit for war. Then the king of Babylon installed Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, as the next king, and he changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem for 11 years. But Zedekiah did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Jumping forward, guys. Just as Jehoiakim had done. These things happened because the Lord's anger against the people of Jerusalem and Judah, until it finally banished them from his presence and sent them into exile. God's judgment comes in 2 waves. First, Jehoiachin and all of his officials, get him out of here. Jeremiah had been preaching that was going to happen for a long time. And then we get a new king who is just as bad. And what happens next is not just scary for an average Joe. I want you to think about this as if you were a devout Jew, someone who grew up knowing that when you went to the temple court, there were certain places you couldn't go, things you couldn't touch, things you shouldn't say, things you shouldn't do, or God might strike you dead with his presence. You were taught to fear God when you went into his house. Round 2. This brings Jeremiah to his knees. He writes an entire book called Lamentations about it. On January 5th, during the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon led his entire army against Jerusalem. They surrounded the city and built siege ramps against its walls. Jerusalem was kept under siege until the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign. By July 18th, the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, the famine in the city became so severe, and the last of the food was entirely gone. Then a section of the city wall was broken down, and since the city was surrounded by Babylonians, the soldiers waited for nightfall and escaped through the gate, running away. And they headed toward the Jordan Valley. But the Babylonian troops chased the king and overtook him on the plains of Jericho, for his men had all deserted and scattered. They captured the king and took him to the king of Babylon, where they pronounced judgment upon Zedekiah. They had Zedekiah watch as they slaughtered his sons. And then they gouged out his eyes, so there'd be nothing more he could see than that memory. Bound him in bronze chains, and led him away as a puppet to Babylon. Yikes. How many of you remember where you were and what you were doing when you first heard or saw the news on 9/11? Like, you can have a tangible memory. No offense, this is Judah's 9/11, and it's even worse. Could you imagine being led away from your city, looking at Jerusalem, God's holy city, God's chosen city, the city of David, a city on a hill, with the Temple Mount visible, and the temple of God, where Yahweh said his name was going to rest for generations, where he was going to bring the whole world to him, and it's burning down. And the places you were not allowed to go as a kid or an adult, soldiers from Babylon are going in and they're stripping all the gold, they're stripping the bronze, they're in the Holy of Holies. They're taking stuff that God said was sacred, that you heard stories about your distant relative dying because he touched it. And you're thinking, how could God let this happen? We were his chosen people. And now he's letting vagrants and pagans desecrate his holy space. Why? Because God said, I don't want sacrifices and junk. I want your heart. And he didn't have any of their hearts. And this is more than, if this building burned down, that would be dreadful. And we'd have terrible board meetings. And we'd be displaced. And we'd be heartbroken because many of you have lived here for generations. And a lot of the structure here was paid for by a bunch of your relatives. But if this place burns down, you still have hope. The temple of God burning down in Jerusalem meant that God had abandoned them completely. That was the place they went for forgiveness. The temple being desecrated means they no longer had hope. Yikes, should be our response. God only puts up with sin for so long. That's the moral of the story. And here's why it matters. Because that's true in your life as well. It's true is salvation as a whole. If you learn anything from some of Peter's apocalyptic writing and the apocalyptic writing in Revelation, it's that God's only going to stay away for so long. One day he's going to come back and set all things right. And he's not going to ask you what you intended to do, who you intended to be. He's going to ask you, did you place your faith and trust, and were you marching in the direction that I prescribed of loving God and loving your neighbor? It's really simple. Did you give me your heart, and were you trusting in me? Because direction, not intention, determines destination. I am afraid that many Christians today embrace the attitudes of the kings that we just read about. If we're honest, there's a bunch of us who just have a hardened abstinence. We look at God and we say, do your frickin' worst. I don't care what you want. I don't care if you're real. I don't even care to try to figure it out. I don't want anybody else telling me how I'm supposed to live my life. I determine what's good. What I want to have happen is what I'm going to pursue. Right? Highway to hell, I'll party with Satan. You know people like that. Hardened abstinence. This is like Jeroboam II. It's like King Ahab. I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do. Bring it, Yahweh. Ooh. Those people, by the way, at the end of the age are said to be cowering behind rocks, trying not to see the glory of God. You don't want to be in that position. But you also don't want to be in the next one. The lukewarm Christian. The person who's measuring their spiritual status based on other people rather than Jesus. You don't want to be King Hosea who said he wasn't as bad as everybody else. Like, I mean, I'm better than my best friends. When I'm with them, I'm not getting drunk with them. I'm just kind of hanging out, right? So we can just, since I'm a little bit morally better than them, God's going to love me incrementally more than him. Who says that being loyal to God means giving him everything? Well, Jesus does, but that's, I guess we need to consider what he'd have to say. The people of this mindset say, surely God will understand my intentions. And then finally, Lord, help us. This is, I think, a camp of a lot of Christians. We end up being the self-righteous folks, the people of the southern kingdom. When other people's lives are falling apart, we say, thank God I'm not them. God would never do that to me. I mean, I prayed a prayer when I was in VBS and I was 6. I'm good to go. You know who my dad was and what he did? You know how much my family, when I was little, contributed to the building campaign in 1990? I'm signed, sealed, delivered. Smooth sailing from here. No. The question is not what you did a mazillion years ago. It's how are you giving your whole heart to all you know of God today? Are you in the right direction, heading in the right direction? All 3 of these heart postures, from hardened and calloused Joe to I'm a little bit better than him, so I'm good to go, to I'm so much better than everybody else, and God would never allow that to happen to me, all lead to the same destination. And I'm telling you, it's not a place you want to end up. So today, the call from the heart postures of the kings and the reality of our lives is, are we willing to turn and walk a new path? There's a reason the Greek word for repentance has a word picture of a 180-degree pivot. I was heading this direction. I was determining what was good in my life and thought God was going to be perfectly fine because my intentions are good. And Jesus says, no, your righteousness in that direction is nothing but filthy rags. I'm going to need an about face. And I'm going to need you to trust in me and allow me to be a lamp unto your path. And I'm just asking you throughout your life to be faithful by putting one foot in front of the other, even if you don't know what the next step is going to be like. Because trust me, in Jesus, you'll end up in the right destination. And if you're trusting in anything else, you won't. So I wonder who needs a change of direction today.